Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 25th, where today we have a quiz scheduled. And believe it or not, we're getting very close to finishing up with most of the chapters in the textbook, which is good news because your first speech is coming up. In fact, your first speech will be due on our next class, which happens to be Tuesday. So if you'll see in the notes below that I've indicated that on Tuesday the 30th, you'll be posting your speech number one. What I'll be doing is I'll be adding a folder in our top Moodle section that's entitled General that will allow you to post your first speech. And I also will be providing instructions for you as to how to post that particular speech. And of course, as you know, we have a quiz due today. So, or at least a quiz scheduled for today, I should say. I'm not going to have it be due until 48 hours after our class meeting, which should be on Thursday. So it would be due on the Saturday. So what I wanted to do was to talk about a couple of chapters in the textbook. Chapter 4 about culture, chapter 5 about audience, and also give you the opportunity to watch some student autobiographical speeches that are posted on YouTube by students like yourselves, but in no way affiliated with GCC. But I thought that these sample student speeches might perhaps give you the idea of how to proceed with your autobiographical speech. And then finally, we'll end with our quiz. And the very last quiz question is about what you are planning to do for your first speech. That said, you could certainly change your mind along the way. So just because you put down an idea for the possibilities for speech one, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't change your mind along the way. So, in terms of culture, and we could spend an entire class talking about culture and an entire semester. Basically, I suppose, in the broadest definition, culture is any kind of group membership. So once you've got a group, which I would suggest would be three or more individuals, I think two individuals would be a couple rather than a group, then basically that group of individuals, they can share certain elements or commonalities. That's not to say that they share all elements, but they share some elements so that there is a predictive nature to the group to which they belong. And that includes things like behaviors, the actions that they take or don't take, attitudes, their emotional responses towards things, beliefs, those things that they find to be true or false, and values, which are very firmly and deeply embedded and probably encompass everything in terms of what I've discussed in relation to culture and cultural elements. And you can see that in the notes below under influences, I've got behaviors, and this includes conversational style. So if you've ever noticed how some people tend to be more long winded and some people tend to be more concise, that can be based on individual variants, but it can also be based on culture. Usually, when we talk about culture, we talk about large groups that share commonalities. For instance, we talk about ethnicity, or we talk about gender, um, or we talk about age, but it doesn't necessarily have to be anything that large. There are multiple cultures and co-cultures. Sometimes the word subculture has been used, but I think that's not a particularly good term because sub suggests lesser than. And it's not that it's lesser than, but it probably isn't as large as, let's say, the demographic cultural group. Demographics, those qualities of observable characteristics. Again, things like gender or age or ethnicity. So that said, a culture can be based on a geographic region, even the culture of Greenfield, Massachusetts, if you wanted to think of it from that perspective. A culture can be based on a hobby. There is such a thing as the culture of a school. So GCC has its own culture, as I've had many students tell me in the past, that it is different from other schools, not necessarily better or worse, just different. And that's in terms of the attitudes, which again, as I had suggested, is based on feelings, beliefs, those things that we view to be true or false, and values, again, all of the above. They can be very highly resistant to change. It's one of the things we'll talk about when we talk about persuasive speeches, in that oftentimes you've got audience members whose values are so highly embedded that there isn't any way that you could change their minds, and you shouldn't try. Well, I guess you could try, but you shouldn't expect to be successful. The mark of a successful persuasive speech is not that everybody agrees with you. That's an impossibility. Is that you've earned everybody's respect, even though they may not necessarily support your particular position. So when we talk about multicultural, we talk about many cultures. And the reality is that we all belong to dozens, if not hundreds, of cultural groups that sometimes intersect and sometimes don't. And we want to be careful that we're not stereotyping, assuming that everybody in the group is exactly the same. But again, there is a certain predictive element. So again, with college students, I can pretty much predict generally how they will dress. I can predict that they probably will be supportive of educational policy. That's not to say that everyone will be, but usually the majority will be. So, as I was indicating earlier, demographics are those characteristics of individuals. The media oftentimes tries to break audiences down into demographics so that it could try to sell products to particular groups, whether it be, let's say, based on, again, age, gender, ethnicity, or education, political affiliation, religion, whatever the case may happen to be. And the textbook, or at least the edition that I had ordered for us, talks about hostile audiences. I don't think you're ever going to be in a situation where you are going to be confronted with a hostile audience. You usually are well aware that you are walking into the lion's den. For instance, a political speech where you are talking to the opposite political party. But you might run into skeptical audiences, and I think that the suggestions are useful for both. You do want to establish some goodwill. That again, that there isn't necessarily negative intent. You want to try to establish areas of agreement. You may not necessarily agree on everything, but at least you can establish some areas in which you agree. Use credible outside sources because that helps to develop your ethos, which we had talked about last class, about the idea of your credibility, ethics, if you will. You want to be as professional as possible in the way that you present yourself and the way that you might present any audios or visuals. And for the first speech, you don't need to present any audio or visuals, but you will be asked to do so for the second speech. Using humor can oftentimes be very effective to bond an audience, but humor can be very culturally based. So, what is funny to one group may not necessarily be funny to another. I think we had talked about this with body language as well, that eye contact is generally seen in Western cultures as a positive. Um, in other cultures, Asian and Hispanic, for instance, it isn't necessarily seen as a positive. It could be seen as a sign of disrespect. And trying to be as multi-sided as possible. A lot of times people don't even necessarily want complete agreement. They just want to be acknowledged that there are other positions. What I call the elephant in the room. You may as well address it rather than pretend that that position doesn't exist. So these suggestions that I have for you about audience and about culture will hopefully help you as well when you are putting together your first speech. Actually, all of your speeches. But your first speech is the speech that is coming up this Tuesday. And that speech is a 5-minute speech in which you are telling the audience, which happens to be your classmates and myself, a little bit about yourself. So you're trying to determine whether or not you're going to be giving a life overview. And if so, what are the major elements that you want to focus on, because you've got only 5 minutes. Perhaps you wanted to focus on a particular time period or a particular element of your life. That said, keep in mind that whatever it is that you discuss, it is up to you to decide how much or how little to self-disclose, as we will see in these sample autobiographical student speeches. Some students, in just the three that I chose as samples, elected to self-disclose more. Some students elected to self-disclose less. But the idea at the ending of the speech is that we should have a little bit more of a sense of who you are. And if you're not quite sure how to proceed, you might want to talk about education, whether it be while you're taking this class as a summer class, what your educational past has been, or what your educational goals for the future are. The one element that we all share as a group, and PCS 101 is a culture. We're a group of people who share behaviors and attitudes and values. So that said, why is it that education binds us together? Well, because we're all taking an educational class. But you don't have to talk about education, and you might want to think about speech 2 or speech 3. And speech 2 and speech 3 can be completely different from what speech 1 is about, or you can use speech 1 as a springboard for speech 2. So if you happen to discuss in speech 1, let's say, that you are an avid basketball fan, then perhaps your informative speech in speech 2 could be about the history of basketball, which actually originated here in Massachusetts. Perhaps your persuasive speech could take that a step further and argue that GCC should have a sports program that focuses on basketball. But again, it could be very different for all three speeches. And while I certainly want you to think a little bit ahead in the future, because ultimately this is a very condensed class, as we know, your focus should be on the first speech. As I said, that for the quiz, and you can see in the notes below that what I am asking you to do for the quiz is to return it via PDF. I have the quiz questions at the bottom of our class notes. I suggest that you copy and paste them into a word processing document and then send that via PDF, which is how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. That'll be due 48 hours from our Thursday class, so that would be Saturday the 27th. And that is in addition to our usual attendance question. And our attendance question on the class discussion form, which will also be due on Saturday on the 27th, is for you, after you've watched those 3 sample autobiographical speeches on YouTube, to identify one strength and one weakness from each of the 3 speeches you've seen. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses. This will give you an idea of what we would have talked about in class, because if we were in a face-to-face class, we would have watched these 3 student speeches, and then we would have talked about their strengths and weaknesses. So after you read everyone's comments and my comments in turn, you'll get a good idea of what it was that we would have discussed during that speech. In terms of your speech, as I had indicated earlier, the very last question of the quiz, question 20, is what do you think you will be discussing for speech number 1? Again, you're not necessarily obligated to follow through, but I want to begin hearing about what you are thinking. And certainly feel free to send me outlines or drafts, or contact me if you wanted to run ideas by me for speech number 1, which you will be posting on Tuesday. I will be providing you with instructions on how to post that onto our site on Tuesday. And after that, you will have the opportunity to watch all of your classmates' speeches. I'll give you some more information about that after everybody has posted their speeches, and we've talked a little bit about that. So, in terms of the class, I'm hopeful that you are thinking about your first speech. And again, I'm certainly here to assist in whatever way I can. So, just feel free to reach out to me. If you'll remember, in the syllabus and other documents folder, I've got a template there that I'm going to be using for evaluating the first speech, where it basically breaks down all of the elements that we've discussed thus far in terms of giving speeches. from the content to the delivery. And that's the template that I'll be filling out when I view your speeches that you have recorded and posted. And remember, this should be um, a video in its entirety. It should not be spliced. It should not be edited. It's a one-shot deal, much like if you were giving this speech live. You would have one time to do so. So the idea is not to have perfection. The idea is to make sure that you are clear and able to communicate with your audience. So this is not a class, as I say, in video editing. So, again, if you've got any questions, please reach out to me. And if you want to run any ideas by me, please reach out to me. And if not, I will leave you to watch these 3 sample speeches on YouTube where I'm asking you to identify strength and a weakness. And I leave you with taking this quiz, which is open book, open notes, that hopefully will be a review of what you've been reading over the course of the semester and what my class videos have been about, just to help reinforce some of the major points we've been discussing. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week. Take care. Bye-bye.